Hi, my name is Allison Willingham. I'm a writer, teacher, blogger, and also a doctoral candidate at the University of South Carolina's Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Over the last year in the state of South Carolina, we have all been mesmerized and probably caught off guard by headlines that suggest that human sex trafficking is a growing problem here in the state. We actually have local law enforcement departments here in the state's capital city that are even establishing task forces to deal with human trafficking. And to top it all off, last month, Attorney General Alan Wilson told the state that human trafficking is the #1 growing crime problem in the entire world, and that in Columbia we sit in between two of the top 20 hubs for human trafficking, Atlanta and Charlotte. But what does this really mean? To many of us, the term human trafficking immediately provokes images of movies we've seen where people are kidnapped by total strangers and sold into international slavery. But is that an accurate depiction of human trafficking? For this installment of my Justice and Justice vlog series, I decided to meet with victims advocates who are headquartered here in the state's capital city of Columbia, but who have also worked firsthand providing services to survivors of human trafficking. These specialists have gained an in-depth understanding and knowledge of both the experiences of the survivors and the conditions in which human sex trafficking actually occur here in the Midlands. Human sex trafficking, for those of you who don't know, is the selling of rape. It involves unwilling participants who are caught in abusive, cyclical, and often very terrifying situations. It's difficult for many of us to actually believe that this crime can occur right here in our own community, in our own public schools. As this vlog unfolds today, we'll also explore the social conditions that have created an environment where sexual violence, and in particular human sex trafficking, can occur.
My name is Marielle Hayes, and I'm the Executive Director at Sexual Trauma Services of the Midlands. Sexual Trauma Services of the Midlands was founded in 1983 as Rape Crisis Network by a group of ladies who are still present and very active and involved with our agency. Our mission is to advocate for and support survivors of sexual assault and abuse and educate the community to identify and prevent sexual violence. Last year, we served more than 2,600 survivors of sexual assault in Richland, Lexington, Newberry, Sumter, and Clarendon counties. Additionally, we provided more than 10,000 community members with education to help identify and prevent sexual violence. Human trafficking is a really complicated issue on the spectrum of sexual violence, and it's become really prominent in our community in the past few years. Last year, more than 115 survivors of human trafficking were identified in the state of South Carolina, and more than 40 of those received services at Sexual Trauma Services of the Midlands. And so we're providing a large array of help and support to survivors who are getting out of a sex trafficking situation. That ranges from being available by our 24-hour hotline, being able to provide hospital accompaniment, so being with that survivor at the hospital as any medical care and evidence is collected. Additionally, providing individual counseling and crisis intervention, dealing with those immediate issues to help those survivors' needs get met, whether that's connecting them with shelter, ensuring that they have access to food, that they have clothing, that their basic needs are met so that they can address the complex trauma that's caused by trafficking.
So my name is Casey Singletary, and I'm the Community Education Director here at Sexual Trauma Services. So just like there are a lot of myths around sexual assault, there are also a lot of myths around trafficking. I think a lot of times people think it's something that happens elsewhere. The media will sensationalize both sexual violence and trafficking, and so we think that it's some big thing like with the movie Taken, or that it happens in other countries, not understanding that it's something that can happen here, that it's happening in our schools, that it's happening in our communities, and even that children can still be living at home and still be trafficked.
So my name is Maggie Mullaney. I'm the trafficking survivor here at Sexual Trauma Services. I do the crisis intervention portion of our services. So 3 to 5 sessions really focusing on safety, stabilization, and coping. Working on, how does trauma affect the brain and how can we make the day-to-day a little bit better. I touch all trafficking survivors that come through the office. They see me first. I do a little bit more intensive case management with these survivors, helping them to get plugged in with as many resources as possible and necessary, and helping them to get their feet wet kind of in the counseling process before they move into our more in-depth counseling, which is where they get to really do more processing of the specific trauma that they've been through. There's a lot of similarities between trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault. Trafficking is sort of portrayed in the media as something like the movie Taken. So somebody is abducted, they're taken to somewhere far away, and usually, drugged or incapacitated in some way and forced into the situation. I'm not saying that's not a real situation, but kind of a more realistic picture is somebody who is groomed. So there is usually an older kind of boyfriend father figure that is coercing younger women into believing that he's there to take care of her, he's there to make her life better, he's going to give her, fulfill any kind of hopes or dreams she might have, whether or not that's, for a family, a relationship, maybe some kind of career path. He's going to make her wildest dreams come true, and really starts to build up a lot of trust and really building a relationship with these young girls, helping them to really believe in some sort of future with them. And then at some point there's a shift and he will kind of have complete control. The trafficker usually works to isolate the survivor from the people that are there to support them, their family and friends. And they worked to usually get them on the wrong side of the law. So introducing drugs and alcohol at a really early age, maybe any kind of other illegal behavior, like, petty theft, that kind of stuff. And they really work to get the survivor to trust them, to isolate them from other people that might be resources to them. And then they at some point introduce, listen, you owe me money. If you want the future that I promised you, you're going to have to, you're going to have to do this to survive.
Just like with sexual violence in general, perpetrators of sexual violence and perpetrators of trafficking look for individuals with a vulnerability. And so youth, I think 14 is the most common age for people to be brought into trafficking. And so they look for vulnerable teens, people who don't have that family support, who don't have those connections that they can isolate from their friends. And they prey on those vulnerabilities and use that to their own advantage.
Okay.
That's one interesting thing about this crime, is that it could be anybody. Ages 14 to 16 are the most common to enter trafficking, but again, we've seen survivors that can be well into adulthood. I would say the universal characteristic is some kind of vulnerability, but who doesn't have a vulnerability? We know that LGBTQ survivors, or LGBTQ population is vulnerable to trafficking. There's high numbers there. younger girls ages 14 to 16 looking for some kind of belonging. Sexual abuse, previous sexual abuse definitely is a higher vulnerability. Foster care is a higher vulnerability. So they definitely know how to pinpoint those vulnerabilities. They're master manipulators, and they can find those weaknesses pretty quickly. What master manipulators these traffickers are, and if they were salespeople for any other thing besides humans, they would be hugely successful, because they really know how to read people. They really know how to set up some kind of ideal of what they're going to provide for a person, and then they're ruthless. Lots of, built up debt. The idea of there's some kind of built up debt. I bought you all of this stuff. I've been letting you stay with me for so long. Now how do you think we're going to pay for it? You owe me this money, so you have to do this for me. Sometimes it's... I saw one scenario of somebody, had two teenage girls come over for a party. They were very intoxicated. They were assaulted and lots of pictures were taken. And when they woke up in the morning, the guy said, "You're not leaving. You're going to be working for us. And if you do leave, we're going to not only spread these pictures to everybody and their mother, but we're going to harm your families." So lots of threats, lots of you're already trapped in this situation and there's no way that you're going to get out of it.
We responded to, again, more than 40 cases of human trafficking in the past year. And while, yes, there is a chance that you could be randomly picked up in the Target parking lot, chances are if somebody's scoping you out at Target, they want to steal your pocketbook or your car. Really, traffickers target vulnerable people who aren't going to be missed immediately. Again, they build a relationship with the person, they build trust with them, and then take advantage of that trust, whether that's through online social media, whether that's through a personal in-person relationship. The really core relationship that happens with this trafficking typically centers around that trust relationship and how do they take advantage of it. So we've really got to focus on building up the boundaries and skills of the youth who we've identified as being most at risk for experiencing this terrible crime. And again, recognizing that trafficking is not something that happens in isolation, that it's part of the wider spectrum of sexual violence in our community, and that we have to address this whole issue at once, that we can't just address the small microcosm of it. I think a lot of the coverage of trafficking can be very sensationalized and exciting. And it's great that trafficking is getting such recognition. But again, complicated problems have complicated solutions. And we've got to be really targeted and focusing on primary prevention and really ending this problem instead of addressing it in a piecemeal way.
So our goal is to prevent sexual violence in general, with trafficking being a part of that. And so what we do is go into classrooms. We start at age 3 and teach children about their bodies. We take the shame away from all body parts, and we talk about relationships and how to identify and respect the boundaries of others. And then as we get into the older grades, we talk about what healthy dating relationships look like, so that when they see, when an older person is trying to engage in a relationship with them and convince them to disobey their parents and push their boundaries in ways that aren't appropriate, they're able to identify that. So really teach them the skills that they need to have healthy relationships, and also to have healthy sexual relationships when they're ready to do that, so that they understand how to negotiate consent and negotiate boundaries with their friends and with their partners, but also how to intervene when they see things going on among their friends. So if they were to see one of their friends being solicited for trafficking, or to be in an unhealthy relationship, or if one of their friends has experienced sexual assault, then they know how to connect them to resources and help them, and hopefully prevent that violence from happening in the first place. The reason we started at an early age, we started age 3, and the reason it's important to start talking to kids at a very early age about their bodies and about consent and about relationships and sexual abuse is because the power lies in the fact that we don't talk about it. When we don't talk about those issues, then it sends the message to kids that they receive that you don't talk about these things. And so we can't ask them to talk to us about things they're experiencing and about questions that they have if we ourselves aren't willing to have those conversations with them. And we can do it in an age-appropriate level. We do groups with parents where we talk to them about how to have those conversations with kids in an age-appropriate way. So you can teach consent without it being sexual consent, but you're practicing those behaviors so that they can develop them as they continue to grow and apply them to various stages of their relationships.
Okay.
Human trafficking represents the commercialization of sexual violence, so it's a way that people found to make money off of rape. And any problem like this that is this complicated is not going to be solved with a single source, with a single factor. It's going to take a lot of ongoing work. But we can't address one without addressing the other. And so it's really critical that organizations like Sexual Trauma Services partners with other nonprofit organizations in our community who are addressing this issue, that we work very closely with law enforcement, that we work very closely with our churches, that we work very closely with other businesses, in identifying how these crimes continue to take hold within our community and eliminating those opportunities. So I would encourage anyone who's watching this to think about the role that they can take in ending human trafficking and sexual violence in our community. Can you volunteer as an advocate to accompany survivors at the hospital? Can you volunteer as a member of a speakers bureau and go out into the community and connect people to agencies like ours? When you see something suspicious, can you pick up the phone and call law enforcement with a tip? And if none of those appeal to you, you can always make a donation and financially support this critical work that's happening in our community. We all have a role and a responsibility to take a part in ending this because it impacts all of us.
I think to prevent a crime like trafficking from happening in our community, we really need to look at the groundwork that is in place for it to exist. So we have a culture where sexual violence is occurring on a regular basis. It's not something that we talk about. South Carolina is number 5 in the nation for women killed as a result of intimate partner violence. And both of these types of issues contribute to a culture where trafficking can exist because a lot of pimps do their recruiting by approaching people as a boyfriend or as an intimate partner. And so when people don't understand what healthy relationships look like, then those types of relationships can be used to bring people into trafficking. With that, the idea that teenagers can be prostitutes is really a misinformed idea. So not understanding what sexual violence is setting up a culture where people believe that youth can be solicited or be used in a commercial sex trade. And all of these types of things contribute to an overall culture where sexual violence is accepted and thought of as something other than what it is. And so by preventing domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and sexual violence, then we take away the framework for trafficking to exist.
Okay.
That's kind of that they don't make money usually, and that's kind of the difference. Is so when you think of prostitution, you think that the person has autonomy over their body. They get to decide who they're gonna work with. They get to decide their terms, like what they can and can't do, how much money they're given, and they can leave the situation at any time. They can get a new career if they want. But with trafficking, it's not that way. So they don't have any say over who they're working with. They don't get to keep any of the money or a significant amount of money to be able to save up enough to leave the situation. And there's no way it doesn't feel like there's any kind of safe escape.
Okay.
A lot of times, especially recently, I guess they might be a runaway, and so they're picked up by law enforcement, and then it comes out that they were trafficked in their time when they were missing. Sometimes the survivor will get fed up and find some way to escape the trafficker. Sometimes the trafficker is arrested, and now they found themselves in a place. All of a sudden, all of this control that was over them is no longer over them, and they have to find resources. It's rare that somebody would be in the trafficking situation and seeking services at the same time.
Right.
So they've found some way to escape, and now they're seeking healing. One survivor told me that her like the people that were keeping her captive were doing a lot of drugs. They stayed up for like 4 days straight, and then they all crashed at the same time, all decided to sleep at the same time, and that's when she decided she was going to grab her stuff and run out of the room. So just finding some opportunity to leave the situation. Usually they just finally something snaps, something breaks, and they find the courage to leave. It's the power and control dynamic. There's definitely a bond that's formed between the trafficker and the person that's trafficked, and because of the amount of control that the trafficker places over that person, I think it can be very hard for them to kind of find a balance once they're out of the situation. They don't know who to turn to, who's supposed to have. It takes a while to find that autonomy again.
Okay.
One thing that is important to remember with this crime, though, and similar with domestic violence, there's a large recidivism rate. So a lot of times the survivor has to leave the situation more than once. They might find themselves going back to the situation and then having to leave again. So that's one thing as an advocate to keep in mind, to not give up on those survivors if they come and seek help and then they fall off for a little bit. That's actually a really normal thing for them to go back to the situation maybe multiple times before they're actually ready to leave. So there is that recidivism rate, and that's usually starts out in the beginning of the intervention. They might go back once or twice, but once their survivor is really ready to stop and to really seek that healing, there's, like I said, there's a lot of resilience there usually. I mean, they're survivors.
Part of the conversation that's ongoing in our community these days is a recognition of how entrenched sexual violence is in our culture. And so I would encourage anyone watching this to take a day, to pick 24 hours or even a shorter period of time, and to notice every time that sexual violence is depicted, whether it's recognizing it in your timeline, in social media, in the articles you read in the news, but paying particularly close attention to the language that is in the music that you listen to and the content of advertising on television or in magazines or online as well, and really noticing how common it is for us to see violence depicted in a way that's very casual. And because we see this so frequently, it can cause us to be less responsive or to recognize it much less frequently than it actually happens. That desensitization is critical because it erodes our respect for one another. And a critical part of that work that we've highlighted at Sexual Trauma Services starts at age 3 and moves through adulthood in age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate ways, working with children and youth and adults at recognizing and engaging in healthy relationships. And so really recognizing boundaries, healthy conflict resolution, communication skills, and ways that we can be better friends and in better romantic relationships with each other. Because when those relationships are founded on a healthy core, we're set up for success in life, and not just being in unhealthy relationships, but also building those skills that prevent us from being vulnerable and at risk for experiencing trafficking as well. So that education is a really critical component of preventing human trafficking.
Something that I love about this job is kind of human resilience to me is astounding. And there is, this is such a horrible thing that could happen to somebody, but there's so much healing that can happen. If you look up survivor speakers of trafficking around our country, there are some really inspirational people that are there, to support other survivors that are starting their own organizations, that are finding ways to combat this issue, and in all sorts of disciplines. So I think that that's one thing that's fascinating, is this is, a horrific crime, but people are resilient.
Hi, I'm Allison Willingham again. I want to say first, thank you for viewing this. This is the first episode of an ongoing vlog called Justice in Justice. It's a larger project that I've started to show how an understanding of the experiences of crime victims is actually helpful for all members of the community. So I hope today that you've enjoyed taking this journey with me to learn more about sex trafficking in South Carolina. With so many headlines emerging in this last year about the growing number of arrests and investigations in our communities, it can be very difficult for us to understand how and why a horrific crime like human trafficking can actually be occurring here in the Midlands to our own children, teenagers, and young adults. Next, I want to thank Sexual Trauma Services of the Midlands for their engaging discussions about the realities of human sex trafficking. An open dialogue that focuses on educating each other about sexual violence is absolutely necessary for both Sexual Trauma Services and us as community members to work together to prevent future incidents of human trafficking in the community. For more information about how you can get involved to help end human sex trafficking and sexual violence in the Midlands region of South Carolina, please visit www.stsm.org.